Well, thank you for being here. My name is Perry Hauser. I am a PhD candidate working with the Department of Geology and also with the Computer Science Cybershare department as well. Today I'll be discussing a class project that we did for commercial imagery involving commercial imagery and ontology applications to view selected military facilities for North Korea and how we can integrate this information and also do a bit of analysis using semantic data. So for this project, I really wanted to look at some of the concepts we learned in the course, the commercial imagery class, and we wanted to tie this into some of the research I do for my dissertation in geology, which involves semantic integration and analysis. And for my geology project, we extend this beyond that to look at visualization of semantic data for geologic field mapping, which involves a technology called augmented reality, where you can actually visualize information in situ during geologic field mapping, which is incredibly useful to be able to look at integrated information from text, from internet sites, and from people in the field, to be able to integrate all this information in the field and be able to look at this visually while you're at the area of study. We won't be able to look at this in North Korea, of course, but we can take a look at what we can do using commercial imagery and being able to integrate this information and looking at spatial relationships and what type of other type of relationships we can build using semantic information. And one of the powers that we're also looking at is how can we utilize the feature of the reasoner, which is included with ontologies. For those who are not familiar with ontologies, in the most kind of layman term you can use, it's roughly a database using an integrated artificial intelligence module to be able to reason information within the database, if you will. And so you can think of it as a way to formalize a knowledge base of a certain domain. And one of the most powerful things that we can get from this is the ability to infer information that wasn't explicitly put into the database by any user. And also we're looking at the ability to reduce the amount of queries and the complexity of the queries when it comes to gathering information from this built knowledge base. So what we're looking at is how we can do proof of concepts of certain areas within North Korea. And so we'll be looking at certain aspects of them, including a nuclear facility and also Air Force and Army and also naval features that we can find within commercial imagery, such as Google or Bing or any other type of satellite information, and be able to bring this into an ontology and see what type of relationships we can do. So the first one we're looking at is what information we can pull in from a nuclear power plant that's just across the border from, or just south of the border of China, and relationships we could bring into this. So this is coming from Google Earth, and we're able to plot various site installations within there using the sites such as 38 North to be able to assist with identifying what's on the ground, and also to be able to identify the importance of these facilities, the installation modules within each other, and be able to at least make spatial relationships and also relate information that might be important to one installation to another installation within the area. So here we're looking at different information we can gather from this particular site, and one of the things as a geologist we want to look at is a couple things involving the river. So we can look at temporal information over a series of different Google images and be able to determine the use and perhaps the amount of the facility's production in terms of just the river. And so here you can see that the river is showing that there's some sandbanks that are exposed, indicating that there is no current water runoff that is involving the experimental light reactor, and which may mean, or at least be able to assume that there may be a limited amount of production in terms of the facility at this moment in time. And you can see also, as from the viewpoint of a geologist, that you can map different series of river levels off of this as well to be able to determine over time the extent of the use of the river in terms of the nuclear power plant. Another thing that we'd be interested in is using thermal imagery, using satellite information like Landsat 7 to be able to use thermal information to be to determine temperature variances over the landscape, and also things like NDVI maps, the Natural Vegetation Index, to be able to determine the growth of the facility over time. So the more that the land is being converted to artificial buildings and whatnot, we can map that as well and give actual quantitative information based off of this. In terms of the ontology, we can be able to infer information, or at least make spatial relationships on the facilities here. So we also have the steam pipes from the cold fire plant leading to the reprocessing building and also to the centrifuge building. So for analysts who are looking at how to block the production of or the facility, the ability for the facility to produce, you can also put in information into the database that there is a cold fire plant that's supplementing energy to a number of buildings, and so that may be also marked as an area that would be interest for being able to halt or reduce the ability of the power plant overall. Another thing that we're looking at is being able to do some automation of data and have the ontology produce some information off of features that are on the ground, such as an artillery site. And so here we're looking at what may or may not be, this is limited, I'm not an expert in the field for any military applications of artillery sites, but an overall look or viewing of some Google imagery, we did come across what may or may not be an artillery site. And so here we're looking at what are these craters on the ground here, and if they were an artillery site, how can we measure this information and be able to derive some extra information from this. So we took measurements of all of the craters here, and also used information based off of the shadows to be able to determine depth based off of the longitude and latitude, and also the time of this picture, and use things like the sun angle calculator to be able to determine depth of the crater, and also look at the impact of these craters. And we do a lot of this in geology as well, when we look at meteorite impacts, where we can tell the size of the object that hit based off of the angle that was penetrated, and also the size of the crater left. So we're applying some of this as well to be able to see a proof of concept of whether or not we can see if this would relate to any sort of artillery firings. And we also looked at a paper where this same method was done with a Russian artillery site in Ukraine, and based off of that we brought this information into this North Korea site. So after measuring the sites here, I think there was some 21 sites that are impact craters that we looked at. We were able to at least relate it to something about a 152 millimeter shell might have created this. And looking at the angles that were brought into, we can roundabout say that this was possibly fired from about 16 kilometers away. And so being able to put this into the ontology, we can look at ways to automate the ability to determine where this came from in terms of the launch site. So if we looked at another area of the imagery here, we can see that we happen 16 kilometers away northwest, 314 degrees northwest, that there happens to be an open area site where there looks like there is where there looks like there could be a firing zone that also looks like the Russian-Ukraine area where there was actually some marking indications on the ground, burn indications on the ground. And so this is one of the things that we're looking to put into ontology as well to facilitate the next time that we come across another one and be able to have a structure for this information to be put into. And other things that we're looking at with the Air Force is to be able to use identification methods to be able to look at airplanes on the ground and be able to identify what type of aircraft there are using the WEFT, the wing, engine, fuselage, and tail indications to be able to identify aircraft on the ground and be able to put this into the ontology. And the idea here is once we have this information brought in, we can start to search the database and give it information that you are able to grab from tools used by like Google Earth in terms of the measurements, and be able to cut down through a list of possible aircraft and have the ontology actually infer or give you the best estimate as to what aircraft there that you may be looking at in terms of reducing from a large list. And so here we're looking at a combined picture here of an air facility, and measure information off of it, such as the runway, and also use, again, temporal information to determine the amount of use of this and what type of use that we're expected to see here. So if we're able to provide to the database that we're looking at a thick fuselage with a forward tapered wings and also back tapered tail, what aircraft information does the database provide us with in terms of identifying what this may be? And so here we're able to do this, and the suggestion was that it was a medium bomber, the IL-28. And also we did this with the MiG-21, where we were able to find 16 of these, looking back at 10 years of satellite information for this. Other things that we're looking at as well is to be able to identify tower height based off of, again, the shadow. So we're able to determine with the algorithm there that this was about 120 feet. So any sort of automation or semi-automation is helpful in this material. Other relationships that we're looking at in terms of the ontology is being able to look at spatial relationships that can reduce the amount of queries and the complexity of the queries. So here we're looking at the SIMPO naval installation, and we're able to find a submarine, and again also use this sort of similar methods to be able to identify what type of submarine this may be, and also tell the database what type of relationships this submarine has with other craft in the area. So we have a towing ship to the right, and also a submersible barge to the left. So if we're able to indicate absolute or relative spatial relationships, then the ontology can map it to the other. So if we put in there that this submarine is related to the ship for towing to the right, then the ontology can also infer that this is to the northeast of the ship as well. So we can tie in these spatial relationships automatically. And we can reduce the amount of queries and the complexity of or especially being able to not miss information because we're querying for absolute queries of spatial as opposed to relative spatial queries. So the ontology can include all that as well. One of the things about the ontology is that notion of flexible vocabulary. So if in geology in particular if we're looking at a feature that is to the right of us, again, we can also infer that this information has a coordinate direction that is to the right of the user. And so we can bring in more information with an ontology than you can a traditional database, and also give the meanings of our entries something more specific than a typical relational database. And the ontologies are already in use with the intelligence community. Here's a list of ones that are already in use. Unfortunately, due to the clandestine nature of them, the power of being able to bring in ontologies and mix and match them is we're not able to do because they're, of course, classified. But they do exist within the IC already, and so it'd be interesting to see what they're doing in terms of furthering the ability to query on this. Here's an example of the ontology. The software was the Protege software that we're using, and also importing information that already exists so that we don't have to build the ontology as much. So like we can, for the definition of what a satellite is, to be able to record information about satellites like the Landsat 7, we don't have to build all these from scratch. And we can basically, like a recipe, grab information that already exists and integrate this information relatively easy. And also include our own custom ontologies as well. So some of the information isn't there, we can customize and add it as needed. And with the ontologies, when they first were in development, there was the notion that we can create a massive ontology to record all knowledge base of a specific domain. And that was proved to be not the most effective way to use them. In fact, it's just the opposite. It's looking at a top-down, bottom-up approach where you have smaller specific ontologies and you mix and match them according to what you're querying, as opposed to having the magic one-size-fits-all type. And so that's what this was built in with as well. So we are integrating ontologies that are specific to time, specific to geospatial, and specific to things like satellites, because we're looking at that, and also the custom one that we're looking to incorporate all this information. It also reduces the amount of the file size and the ability to take this where you need to go. And for geology, this is important because we're out in the middle of nowhere, and there will either be limited or most likely no internet. And so to be able to take a knowledge base with you, a chunk of the internet if you will, and be able to query and access this information, especially assisted with the ontology, is something that can be very powerful. And in terms of the reasoner, you can see that before, this is the information that is provided just by the user. This is explicit information. The inferred information is shown in yellow here. So this is information that wasn't explicitly put into the database, that was inferred by the ontology based off of the structure of the ontology and any relationships that we included in there. So you can see that there's quite a bit of extra information that we don't have to spend time entering in, and also it's information that would be provided to the user without having to do any queries whatsoever. And if you were to do queries, this is my last slide here, then you can make them relatively simple queries. They're not overly complex queries, and they utilize some natural language, which is, if you're looking for a ship that accompanies some submarine, you basically write, you're looking for a ship that accompanies some submarine. This would cover the list of different queries with the ontology, so it would also look for ships that are to the east of the submarine, and ships that are to the west of this, and also to the left and right. This sort of absolute and relative searches are included as well. That's about it for now. Thank you very much.